releasing the wildly successful and highly polished Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition last year, Age of Empires 3 Definitive Edition has just been released and looks to live up to that high bar of quality. In this video today, I will look into how this new release compares to the 2005 original game and how it performs. But before I look at that definitive edition of this seminal game, we have to talk about the technology powering the original game, which was quite fascinating at its release. See, when Age of Empires 3 came out, the transition of the real-time strategy genre into 3D was genuinely set into stone. More than 5 years had already passed since Homeworld from Relic Entertainment had conclusively brought RTS into 3D with gameplay that exquisitely utilized that new 3D space. Homeworld was essentially gorgeous, and after seeing that game, I'm not sure many genre veterans could actually stare at low-resolution sprite artwork ever the same again. For the makers of the Age of Empires series at Ensemble Studios, it took a bit longer though to transition its games from 2D scapes into 3D. So while other game development teams like Massive cut their teeth in 3D with excellent games like Ground Control in 2000 and proved the viability of 3D for ground combat games, Ensemble released its first 3D RTS game almost 3 years later after Homeworld and a bit after being acquired by Microsoft. Age of Mythology in 2002 was a spiritual successor to Age of Empires 2 and plays a heck of a lot like it. And for a game from 2002, it uses the technology of the time quite well. It renders just as many units and buildings in full 3D as the sprite-based engine for Age of Empires 2 did in 2D. Animations were suitably complex, and the characters and aesthetic of those Mediterranean legends it was based on held up pretty well given how much was happening on the screen at the time. But where a game like Homeworld could dazzle with slick backdrops and effects work due to its sparse environments, limitations of 3D rendering at the time still affected the look of Age of Mythology. With larger unit counts and terrain and wildlife and fauna needing to be rendered in 3D, other aspects were not completely high-end. Units and buildings, for example, just had simple drop shadows underneath themselves. So lighting was not the game's strong point, even though its color palette and general geometric complexity were. And since Age of Mythology came out in that era before bump mapping and real-time post-processing had become completely prevalent, it can look a bit plain at times. A bit like watching a Quake 2 or Quake 3 arena level from afar. Large-scale transparency effects were also still quite expensive on PC. So the battles and destruction in Age of Mythology did not have the flashy effects work to communicate the scale and pandemonium of mythic proportions. It was a great first entry into 3D though, which captured the style and look of previous Ensemble games, but graphics technology still needed some room for improvement to communicate it all so perfectly. In the time between Age of Mythology and Age of Empires 3, seasoned contemporaries of Ensemble released their own real-time strategy games with impressive visual presentations. Whether that be the explosive effects work and stencil shadows deployed in Westwood's Command & Conquer Generals, or the impressive animation and attention to detail in models in Relic's Warhammer 40,000 Dawn of War. With such visually splendid games upping the competition, expectations were definitely high for Ensemble at the time. They had to not only create a good successor to Age of Empires, but they had to create a game also that could visually go toe-to-toe with its peers or even exceed them. I would definitely say that Age of Empires 3 for a 2005 release hit above expectations. The game essentially offered the same amount of units on screen as found in Age of Mythology, while also ramping up the CPU and GPU effects work. Firstly, you have each and every object in the game now casting real-time shadow maps from the sun. From the lowliest settler to the largest capital ship, they all cast real-time shadows, something not at all really common in games from 2005. Shadows cast from ships and other objects even cast onto the transparent water and the terrain beneath the water, giving this neat parallax effect of depth. Along with that, new pixel shading functions from DX9 are used to great effect, with a post-process bloom being found across the entire image, and now surfaces support specularity and normal mapped features, so metals look shiny and terrain can look suitably bumpy. Water itself is perhaps my favorite rendering feature in this game, with its surface both having normal map variation and planar reflections for units and terrain, so you get this almost Far Cry-like reflective water in an RTS game. There are even neat little details like wave crests that form in certain areas, or foam as the water nears sandy shores. In addition to more purely visually related effects like that, there was also a large focus in Age of Empires 3 to amp up effects, destruction, and dynamic elements in the game world. So buildings importantly chip and fall apart as they take damage, with each drop of health reducing the structure and blowing off parts of it with their own physics. And when the structure can take no more, it explodes or falls in on itself with some really spectacular effects work. Cannonballs are real physics objects in the game as well, which can bounce and skid off the ground, divot on stopping, or even roll around with their own physics. They can even cause palm trees in the way to break. In 2005, such physics interactions were not exactly common in real-time strategy games, even though they were making their way into other genres. So seeing them at this scale in Age of Empires 3 was quite awesome for the time. The one area that did not arguably see a great update over Age of Mythology was in animation work and character models. This amount of detail was fine around the time of Age of Mythology, but Age of Empires 3 look a bit stilted and low poly, especially now that you can zoom into them with ease like you could find in other games from that time period. Along with these graphical flourishes, the game was updated over time accordingly and scales pretty well. It supports 16:9 resolutions and generally has little performance issues under the latest versions of Windows, although I have seen it dip down in performance at times that made little sense. The issues that it has are more common legacy things that we see in other games from this era. Like the shadow maps, for example. They were awesome in 2005, but they sure do wobble and alias a lot in a distracting way with their low resolution nowadays. And while the game does support arbitrary resolutions and 16:9, the default UI elements are pretty large and take up massive amounts of the play space, even at high resolution. And then you have other tiny things like how cutscenes play back with black bars on the top and bottom when running at 16:9, or how the resolution scaling seems to cause weird border and seam lines to appear in artwork at times. Those would probably not be there at lower resolutions or in 4:3 aspect ratio. So the game could use some polish for modern expectations, and that's where the definitive edition steps in. So in the definitive edition, the UI is now extremely customizable and has multiple modes that arrange it in different manners. The updated UI in general has a more thoughtful usage of screen space, with no empty blocks of UI in a thick bar like the original game. So when you are playing, you can see more of the battlefield at any one given moment than you would in the original game. You also have a greater control over your modern or classic hotkeys, and a short but to the point graphical options menu. Cutscenes also now play back at a proper true 16:9, and loading is unmentionably quick. In terms of assets, the game is completely different, with each 2D and 3D element being redone. All unit models and textures are of a much higher quality, and many more polygons are used to represent things which were just textures in the original. The game's buildings, for example, show this off very well, where the art design is maintained, but low fidelity textures and edges are brought into a higher fidelity realm and are made into real 3D in many instances. The greater polygon count on units does change the game's aesthetic slightly though, but it's in a direction that I like. The original game has a bit of a toy soldier-like look, and here the proportions seem a little less exaggerated from the default camera angle. As I say that though, there is great care in this definitive edition to maintain the original game's look and color palettes and general designs, where any one paused frame looks very similar to the original game, but just better. As part of that, the bloom this time around is also a little less overwhelming, which I think is a positive outcome. Shadow maps now are of a much higher resolution and are well filtered, so they no longer have that great visible aliasing motion that you could see in the original game. As a part of the game's lighting now, the game uses screen space ambient occlusion, which helps ground those objects in shadow much better than the original game really ever could. Water rendering receives just as much attention to detail as it did in the original game, but with some key differences. Reflections are now handled by screen space reflections in this version, which have their own positives and negatives of course, but water interaction has been added as well. So a ship or an object moving in the water deforms the water surface with flowing lines and breaking waves, which really do make the ships in water, for example, look that much better. Other water features are preserved from the original game at a much higher detail, like the 3D cresting waves lapping onto sandy beach shores. It's really excellent looking. But there is one issue getting in the way of it being completely perfect. Water renders oddly in the corners of screens at times, causing it to clip in and out visibly when the camera moves. You can see this in cutscenes. It's not exactly the most important visual aspect, but still, it's something that my eye noticed and could be improved. But in general, all the assets are heavily upgraded and changed and look a lot better. But not everything is so different in the definitive version. Animations, for example, seem largely untouched. I presume this was done to maintain the same gameplay speed and character movement quirks that established the game's balance. Animations and timings in cutscenes are even the same here, though cutscenes do have different camera angles at times. Another good thing that stays, thankfully, is the game's usage of effects work and physicalized environments. These seem to work the exact same, but have the remastered art treatment, where explosions look particularly awesome, just like they did before. And when it all comes together, this game looks really spectacular, and much better than the original. Gameplay-wise, it also plays the exact same as far as I can tell when I played them back-to-back in a casual manner. I only noticed some smaller things of difference, like how the priest, for example, heals with a passive ability that he does on his own now, unlike the castable effect in the original game. But I didn't notice anything else really. So if you did enjoy Age of Empires 3's gameplay and want to see it kept intact, this version appears to do that just fine. In terms of performance, I have both positive and negative things to report here. 4K 60 is doable on GPUs that are RTX 2080 Ti caliber and above, based upon what I found here, but the game doesn't allow it to be done correctly due to how the frame rate locks in the current version. You may have even noticed this from the footage in this video. See, each and every 3D scene in this game, whether it be a cutscene or direct gameplay, is never hitting a real V-synced 60 FPS at 60 Hz, even though a GPU could be generously underutilized. So the GPU could be producing more frames, but it is not for some reason, and performance is below the refresh target. For a third-person or first-person game, this would be extremely problematic. But with the camera placement above the battlefield here, it's generally most visible on unit movement or the inconsistency it brings into mouse response. This behavior happens no matter what the refresh rate is or whether or not VSync is on. So if you use a 120Hz display or higher, this problem occurs, but the frame rate finds itself at a correspondingly lower number, so like 110 FPS at 120Hz. As I mentioned, turning off VSync does not alleviate the issue. On AMD, I saw very similar behavior at 60 and 120Hz with VSync off. So the frame rate there is also always below the refresh rate no matter what, and the GPU is underutilized. When VSync was turned on there for AMD though, that essentially broke the game's performance for some reason. Either the frame times became extremely erratic and the game slows down and speeds up constantly and has a very bad visual look, or the frame rate just locks down to half of the refresh rate. So something in the game engine is limiting the frame rate below refresh rate in general, no matter what GPU you have, and the GPU anyways is being underutilized while this is happening, even though it could easily lock to the target refresh rate. On AMD, the VSync behavior is just not right at all and not functioning. Both of these problems really need fixing. I'm not sure why this is happening, of course, but it may have to do with the fact that the game does not have a real exclusive full screen in the traditional sense. So it can tear, but the output resolution is always tied to your desktop resolution. So if you had 120Hz desktop resolution at 1440p, but 4K selected in game, it will be downsampling that 4K and outputting it at 1440p 120Hz. As for the graphical settings and which ones you should want to pick for optimized settings, the answer was easy to find out in my testing. For example, shaders from high to low have no significant degradation to visuals and no significant impact on performance. So for that, I would recommend high to ensure the best looking visuals at all times. The shadow setting from very high going down to medium rather handsomely reduces the resolution of the game's shadow maps and has little to no measurable effect on performance. Turning off shadow maps drastically alters the game's visuals, as shading effects and the game's overall look is dependent on shadow maps. It does yield a 45% increase in performance though on an RX 5700 at 4K. Here I recommend the very high setting for my optimized settings, as it is similar in performance to medium and looks much better. Turning down the vegetation from high to medium gets rid of the game's polygonal grass that covers the ground on many levels and offers a substantial 25% performance increase. Going down to low further eliminates some larger plants in the scene, but does not significantly change the GPU performance in comparison to medium. Here I find any setting other than high to be very detrimental to the game's core look, so high is in my optimized settings. After this, the water setting is very much so the same. Going from high to medium eliminates the surface normal effect on the water and makes the ocean look almost like a placid mountain lake in comparison. It also offers up little to no measurable performance difference at 4K on an RX 5700. Going down to low turns off all specularity on the water and gets rid of screen space reflections on them as well. In this scene, it also did not have a measurable impact on performance at 4K on the RX 5700. So high is definitely the optimized settings here. All the other settings in the menu should be set to their highest and left on, as they're important to the game's visual makeup and should not be turned off unless you have an older, low-powered GPU. For example, turning off SSAO yields a 15% performance increase, but it takes away a lot of the depth in the image's lighting. The only setting you might want to tweak would be texture quality, which reduces the resolution of textures the lower it is set. It is not exactly easy to see the difference though at normal camera distance, and is really only very visible on alpha masked textures like vegetation. Here the game at 4K allocated a little bit more than 6 GB at high on the RX 5700, and 4.5 on medium, and a little less than that on low. Here I recommend high for any GPU with 6 GB of VRAM or more, and medium for a card with less VRAM. In the end here, the allocated RAM does not line up with the actual amount used, as 6 GB was enough on an RTX 2060 when I tried this game at 4K, and it did not stutter. Altogether, my optimized settings are just the highest settings possible, basically, as those settings that do scale well in performance take away the advantages that remastered visuals have in the first place. And although these settings may be nominally high, they're extremely light for most GPUs, but not all GPUs. Going to the mid-range here at 1440p with VSync off at 120Hz with these settings revealed that there is a large gap in performance in this game between Nvidia and AMD GPUs, which usually should be neck and neck. Usually at this resolution, the RX 5700 and RTX 2060 Super should be very similar to one another. But in this game at these settings, the RTX 2060 Super manages to be around 20% faster and very easily runs the game at 1440p and 60 FPS. So the game is very fast on Nvidia cards, but it is a little slower on AMD, and the RX 5700 here would find itself dipping below 60 FPS in more complex scenes like those with vegetation, or if there's going to be a lot of mayhem and alpha effects on screen. So AMD performance is not exactly where it should be in this game at the moment. Coming to the end of this video here, I can say that Age of Empires 3 Definitive Edition has really well done technology and art upgrades, but I always thought the original game looked pretty great for the time it came out. On top of that, the UI experience and the whole gameplay package is preserved and even better than the original. So if you ever wanted to play all the campaigns that have come out and more and multiplayer, this is where you should start. But there are some technical problems at the moment that need to be fixed to make this the most perfect experience that it should be. That frame rate limit problem that occurs a few FPS below the refresh rate really needs fixing. Likewise, AMD's VSync performance and general performance needs to be better, and the developers need to really look into that. When those things are fixed, the Definitive Edition will truly live up to its great name. And until then, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did enjoy it, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, then hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you want to help us out, support Digital Foundry on Patreon to get years worth of Digital Foundry content available in high quality for download. If you want to talk to me about Age of Empires 3 or any other RTS games, write a comment below or follow me and Digital Foundry on Twitter. And as always, this is Alex, bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.